Hey, Sydney. So on number 5, the first thing that you really need to do on this one is FOIL. So 1 times 1, 1 times cosine theta, and then the inside negative cosine times 1, so minus, minus cosine theta, and then negative times positive, so minus, and then cosine times cosine is going to be cosine squared. And then when the plus cosine and minus cosine cancel out, you've got cosecant, which is 1 over sine, times 1 minus cosine squared. And so this is part of the reason that, like, anytime you see a squared, you should think of the Pythagorean theorem stuff. So one of the Pythagorean identities was sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So this one has a 1 in it, and it has a cosine squared in it, but it doesn't have them arranged the same way that the identity does. So if this problem has 1 minus cosine squared, then I can subtract cosine squared from both sides, and that leaves me with sine squared equals 1 minus cosine squared. So now I can take 1 minus cosine squared and put sine squared in its place, because the Pythagorean identity tells me that 1 minus cosine squared is equal to sine squared. So then that becomes 1 over sine theta for our cosecant, and then 1 minus cosine squared is really the same as sine squared, and then when you multiply those, a sign on bottom cancels out the sign on one of the signs on top, so all that's left in that one is sine theta. So that's it for number 5. Number 6, so I think I showed you this much, and then, or I talked about this much. So sine squared times secant is really sine squared times 1 over cosine. So that's where sine squared over cosine came from. So if I get a common denominator here, then that becomes, let's see, we've got 1 over cosine in front. That's still just kind of hanging around. And then we've got cosine squared over cosine plus sine squared over cosine. And then add the numerators together. So we've got 1 over cosine in front, and we've got cosine squared plus sine squared on top, and then cosine on bottom. And so there are those squareds again. So sine squared plus cosine squared is really equal to 1. So that's 1 over cosine. So that turns into 1 over cosine squared. And 1 over means the reciprocal of. So the reciprocal of cosine is secant. So that ends up just being secant squared theta. So email me back and let me know if any of that makes sense. And if not, then we can go over it again.